Kori Schake, what do you make of that? What has just happened with President Trump and his own people at home, plus his allies abroad?
Well, the first thing is that the president is clearly trying to reverse himself and denying that he said things he said on the record, and over which Secretary Mattis resigned. And it looks like Secretary Pompeo going to the region and the National Security Advisor are hearing from allies what all the rest of us heard from allies, which is that ISIS isn't defeated. If the United States withdraws, we will leave our forces in the region, our allies in the region, and 74 other countries are part of the anti-ISIS coalition. All of them are left in the lurch by this, and the president underestimates how damaging it is to American policies, and not just in the Middle East, for the United States to be unreliable like this.
So we're talking essentially about presidential leadership as this new year starts. We just heard about leadership at home and now global leadership. One of the criticisms is that he has sort of distanced allies and accommodated adversaries and competitors and seemed to, as you just said, be an unreliable friend. In other words, not necessarily want American global leadership.
Yeah.
What do you think? I mean, clearly, he got the message and he, under advisement, is not going to do this shock thing in Syria immediately. That's a good thing, right? There was a debate, there was a statement, there was backlash, there was back and forth, and he's now reversed himself or adjusted the move right now.
You're absolutely right. It's a better policy that he appears to be adopting, but that policy was also available to him a month ago, and he would have still had a competent defense secretary, and he would have still had American allies fighting in the region who believed they could rely on us. And that is the opportunity cost of the president choosing to make policy in such an erratic way.
So before I get to Secretary Mattis, because you wrote a book with him, you edited a book with him, and you're quite close to his thinking, and you know quite a lot about him. But before I get to that, because he was considered certainly by allies all over the world as somebody with the experience and the heft that they could rely on to continue traditional American foreign policy. Let's get to that in a moment. I want to ask you what you think, beyond ISIS, would have happened if President Trump had left the field open to Russia, to Iran, to Assad. And he even said, at this same presser, Iran can have it. We don't care. It's just a bunch of sand and death.
Yeah, so several things. First, I think you should anticipate that Turkey will move against the Kurdish forces, certainly in Syria, possibly even in northern Iraq, because the weakening of the government of Iraq is another consequence of President Trump's policy. I think you should expect Russia to have a long-term military presence in Syria, because after all, Bashar al-Assad would not still be in power if Russia hadn't moved in militarily to protect him. I think you should expect Iran and Russia to be elbowing each other for the glory that comes with that. The Iranians did the hardest, most dangerous work on the ground. They are now even in southern Syria, something the Israelis are having to deal with. That, too, is a consequence of us, President Trump saying that the Iranians can do whatever they want. And it destroys our policy towards Iran, which seems to be their top priority in the Middle East, was focusing everybody on Iran.
I have to tell you, I have been trying to figure that bit of it out, because the whole rationale for getting out of the Iran nuclear deal was to gather a coalition against Iran and precisely to affect Iran's behavior in places like Syria, Iran's negative behavior in Syria. And now the president is saying, well, they want it more than us, they can have it.
Right. If you were an American regional ally, if you were Iraq or even Saudi Arabia or the UAE, the United States has not only destroyed our policy, we've destroyed their policy. And the president did it sequentially, encouraging the Saudis and the UAE in their feud with Qatar. and not taking account of how Russia was going to play this, how Turkey was going to play this. I think the problem with your analysis is you assume there's a guiding logic to it, instead of just a bunch of sloppy, erratic, undisciplined choices where they are not thinking their way through the consequences of it, nearly as well as you are thinking your way through the consequences of it.
So let's talk about the real, well, one of the real issues, and that was, to end ISIS dominance. Now, the president and others say that it is all but defeated. But some people, a Pentagon report and others have said, actually, that's not the case. They're still pretty strong in Iraq, despite, being turfed out of Mosul. They still exist in Syria. There's still tens of thousands of them around. What are the facts about ISIS and about them potentially coming back to the West?
So the president is right that ISIS no longer holds major swaths of territory in the way that it did. But he wrongly believes that defeated means never coming back. And we've seen this movie so many times before. We saw it in Iraq after the 2003 invasion, where if you don't stabilize communities, if you don't ensure that governance is working and people have the ability to support themselves, that leaves fertile ground for the rise of jihadist organizations. It did in Iraq, it did in Syria, it is in other places. Stable governance is the solution to this problem.
Fine, but what happens when all the United States and its allies are doing is war and not really promoting stable governance? And the president presumably has a point that we can't have these never-ending wars. It's just gone on for so long. 17 years and counting in Afghanistan. In fact, he kind of blamed Secretary Mattis a little bit, saying, well, he didn't, I gave him billions of dollars when he asked me to stay in Afghanistan. I wanted to pull out. And look, we're still in a major problem here. What should the United States be doing to actually get rid of the military and the insurgent threat, but also pave the way for stable governance?
If anyone has a better strategy than the patient nation-building strategy in Afghanistan, I would love to hear it. I would love to adopt it. But the strategy that we have taken is, with governance at the center of it, to train the forces and grow the political leadership of countries so that they can carry on these problems.
Do you believe that, 14,000 U.S. troops are going to be pulled out? There was some suggestion that the president had alluded to that. Is the community of foreign policy experts, military experts, expecting that to be the next shoe that drops?
So the challenge is Afghanistan making enough progress for us to continue to keep those troops there? And that is exactly the right question. Should the United States still be fighting in Afghanistan? And I think the answer to the question is it depends on whether Afghanistan is making the progress in recruiting, training, in governance. And Afghanistan is. It's slow, it's uneven, it's unpleasant, but Afghans are still signing up for their own security forces, even though they are the targets of the Taliban and other jihadist forces. They deserve our help to try and get to a better place, because the alternative is an American strategy where we swoop in, kill bad guys, then leave the place for bad things to happen. And that's how your intelligence sources dry up. That's how the goodwill that your forces are operating under dry up. That's how belief that the United States has a better solution to problems than people just accepting the bad forces in their midst. That's what we know about fighting these problems.
So let's just get back to Secretary of State Mattis, who, of course, was the commanding general. He, in his time, he was a force commander and a major military strategist on the ground. You've written that his resignation letter was perhaps one of his biggest contributions to democracy and strategy in the 2 years that he was Secretary of State. What do you mean by that? What specifically?
So Secretary Mattis in his resignation letter did two really important things. First, he made the case for an allied centric American policy. That is, by helping allies, we help ourselves. That has been more or less American strategy since 1945, and President Trump is the first big departure from it. So the first thing Secretary Mattis did, Secretary of Defense Mattis did, was reinforce that the American policy that has allies at its center isn't some nefarious deep state effort to constrain the president. There's a reason it's the establishment view, and that's because there's not a better alternative, as unsatisfying as it may at moments be. But the second important thing Secretary Mattis did in his resignation was point out that the president deserves to have a cabinet that supports his policies and works assiduously to carry them out, and that it's wrong for major political appointees to work in opposition to the president's objectives. And that, too, is an important part of American governance.
It is indeed. But you also found a little bit of fault with a guy you clearly admire. You say that his silence over the years, his public silence over the years as secretary, he didn't give many interviews, hardly any. He didn't want to be seen as contradicting the commander-in-chief in public. You said that he missed an opportunity to be, you know, both Secretary of Defense and sort of guardian, certainly for the troops and for those who fall under his purview.
Absolutely right. That the president's not making the case for the wars. The vice president occasionally makes the case for the wars. It really matters 45 years into an all-volunteer force and 19 years into the war that we're fighting in Afghanistan for the country's leadership to explain to the American people and to validate for the people we're putting in harm's way what it is we are doing. And the president's not willing to do that. And I think Secretary Mattis, for understandable reasons, didn't do it. But it's bad for the war effort that he didn't do it.
So let's get beyond the war effort, if we can, because it is quite troubling that America has been locked in these wars for so long, and there seems to be no real sort of discussion, certainly not publicly, about how to make them work, how to bring the American people on board if necessary. But certainly nation building does not happen, and that's a problem, basically.
Oh, absolutely.
But let me just ask you this, because what do you see as this year in terms of, let's just say, the Saudi Gulf strategy? The president went there, his first trip as president, January 2017 or early 2017, he went to Saudi Arabia and Israel, and they concocted a plan to contain Iran and et cetera. Where does that all stand? How do you see that piece of the Middle East going forward now?
I think that's in tatters, both because of the president's erratic behavior, but also because of the behavior of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, that it is, you know, at the Double-I Double-S Manama dialogue in the fall, the Saudi foreign minister said that Saudi Arabia has a vision of light for the region and Iran has a vision of darkness. And it's very hard for the rest of us to see the difference given the Saudi government's behavior. So I think the president's policy is in tatters. I think Secretary of State Pompeo is traveling to the region to try and figure out where we can go together from here. But it's very hard that America's traditional allies in the region are unnerved, and America's new friends in the region are unnerved. The only people who aren't are America's actual adversaries.
Russia.
Who else? China.
Well, let's talk about China, because as we speak, there were talks underway in Beijing to try to head off the worst effects of the trade war that could affect the whole global economy. What do you see, and where do you see strategically that confrontation over tariffs and the rest of it going?
Yeah, I don't see the basis for much cooperation on that. The Wall Street Journal came out editorially saying that the biggest own goal of the Trump administration, and possibly ever, was the U.S. withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership.
Which is one of the first things the president did.
Exactly. Not only because of the damage it does to American markets in Japan and other places, but also because this was our opportunity to consolidate the ability to contain China's behavior that's trying to upset the rules of the game in Asia. That we have lots of friends and allies, but the polling now suggests that while countries in Asia don't want Chinese dominance, they also don't trust American reliability. And that's something that President Trump's behavior in office has created.
And that is new, frankly, when it comes to America. But just one last question. You also wrote that President Trump's announcement of pulling out of Syria was also an own goal. You know, he did something that the Obama administration hadn't done. He had a better policy, you say, in Syria than the Obama administration.
Yeah, he actually did. And with the National Defense Strategy, the national security strategy and the national defense strategy both said we need to refocus on rising powers and great power competition. So you could withdraw from Syria, drawing down gently in a way that supported our allies and created stability in the region. He chose not to, and that really invalidated his own strategy.
Well, and this is a really dangerous region, as we've seen over the last many, many years. It's going to be really important to keep an eye on it. Kori Schake, thank you so much for joining us.
It was a great pleasure.
Thank you. And now